What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. We are going over something that was requested, which I was kind of hoping that something would be after putting out the autopilot video. Uh, Somebody reached out, asked if I could do something on the MCP, like going over some of the buttons and stuff on the MCP. And sure, that was actually one of the next things I was looking at doing. So that's what this video is going to be. We're going to look at the mode control panel on the 7576, and we're going to talk about some of the buttons on it. I'm not going to go into how you're going to use them necessarily for navigation or anything like that. Just simply what the buttons do to the panel and what the system behind it will do. I don't want to dive into the VNav, LNav stuff and all that in this video. I just feel like that would take entirely too long. And I'll be honest, that is one of the things I need to study on just a little bit more before I can do a video on it. Before we get started, I've got shirts. This one you probably can't see because of my beard, but it's Keep the Blue Side Up, Life Advice 101. Those are all available on the website. If you go to gsiguy.com and go to the, I think it's the merch shop tab, and then they're located in there. If you want to buy a shirt, awesome. If you don't want to buy a shirt, fine. It helps the channel, helps me be able to keep doing this kind of stuff. So anything and everything is appreciated. All right, so going into or jumping off from the autopilot video that I just did, then I'll put a card up here linking it to that video. I went over the MCP real quick, and the MCP is the mode control panel. If you don't remember what the mode control panel is, it's that part there on the glare shield where you input all of your stuff for the autopilot and tell the autopilot what you want to do, right? And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. And we're going to start by talking about how we basically have 3 levels of automation when it comes to the airplane. And when we have 3 levels of automation, people are like, well, the first level's not really automation because we're talking about it basically being manual, right? So, and by manual, I mean that you're sitting in an airplane, you're adjusting the throttles, you're adjusting, your vertical this way, vertical and lateral navigation this way, and your speed with the thrust levers or throttles, whatever you want to call them. That is the lowest level of automation you can have. Now, why do I say it's automation if you're manually flying the airplane? Well, it's because you're using instruments in the aircraft that uses automation, right? So you've got your ADI, your HSI, or your primary flight display and your nav display, depending on which airplane you're in. And then your gauges and everything, like all of your engine gauges and your ICAS and all the inputs that you're getting is a level of automation. Granted, the flying portion of it is manual. I get that. But you are using inputs from an automated source. So that's why we call that the lowest level of automation. The next one is going to be autopilot inputs from a pilot, meaning that I have an autopilot engaged. I'm putting in my heading. I'm putting in my speed. I'm putting in my vertical speed. I'm putting in my altitude, all on that MCP. And I'm telling the autopilot where I want it to go. And I'm making the inputs, telling the autopilot where I want it to go and what I want it to do. Okay? So that's the next level of automation. The third level, which would be considered the highest level in this particular aircraft, is going to be the FMC driving the airplane. Okay, so we haven't really talked about the FMC, but if you want to know, FMC is flight management computer, right? This is kind of a generic. I say generic; it's not really generic. It's a sim FMC. So you can go through and put all this stuff in, but this is actually not an FMC. I'm going to ask the question, what is the name of this? We call it an FMC, but it's not. The FMC is actually located in the nose, in the electronic equipment cabinet. This is the control head for it, But what is this actually called? What is the name of this? I'm not going to answer that question for you. I'll leave that alone and see if anybody can answer it in the comments. When the FMC is driving the airplane, what do you see on your navigation? You're going to see a magenta line, right? The magenta line means that the FMC is taking over and it is driving the airplane to whatever direction you're going. And that's why you'll hear people call it the effing magenta computer, because every time the computer's running it, you get a magenta something. Whether it's a magenta marker on your thrust, whether it's a magenta line in your navigation, if the FMC is controlling, usually it turns to magenta. Okay? So here, these are our 3 levels of automation. And why does the 3 levels of automation matter? Well, it's going to determine how we use the MCP and what buttons we use and what we're looking for on the MCP itself. So I showed this in the autopilot video, but the one down here on the bottom right, this is not a 7.6. I understand that. It's just an idea of showing you a different looking MCP. They all basically have the same types of controls on them. Some are slightly more advanced than others, but you get the idea. The one here on the top left, that is the 7.6 MCP. So the 7.6 MCP has quite a few buttons on it, and we'll go through and we'll talk about each one. Now, most of you probably have seen, or at least have gotten some of your automation knowledge from this guy.
Boom. Click, 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 click. Straight to the lowest.
And we'll talk about what he's meaning when he says click, 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 click. But I'm sure if you've been in the 7.6 industry for any amount of time, you've seen this video at least once. And if you haven't, I'm going to tell you what it is. It's the Children of the Magenta video. You can go to YouTube. I'll put a link in the description. You can find it online pretty easy. It's from the early 90s, mid 90s, where this guy's explaining different levels of automation in aircraft. Not necessarily the 7.5, 7.6, but different levels of automation in the aircraft. That's where my 3 levels of automation come from, is from this video. Does a very good job explaining it, does a very good job going through it, and there is some dry humor in it. It's about a 25-minute video. I suggest that if you guys are interested in it and whatsoever and you haven't seen it, go watch it. It gives some pretty cool insights to the different levels of automation and how pilots have transitioned a little bit from being pilots to being more system managers. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not trying to knock anybody for that. I'm not trying to say that that's a bad thing or it's a good thing or whatever. But let's face it. When you get off the ground and you go center command and you are flying along with the autopilot, are you really flying the airplane, or are you kind of managing the systems? You're managing the systems. That's not a bad thing. That you still get to be on the airplane. You still get to fly it, to land it, to take it off, and all that kind of stuff, right? It's still an awesome thing that you get to do. You just manage things a little bit more when you get into bigger airplanes, transport category aircraft, right? A lot of that, it's all for safety and, workload management and all that kind of stuff. He does a great job explaining that as well. But he also explains how going down in levels of automation could actually reduce your workload depending on the situation. Simply because you have to remember, oh, that's right, I am a pilot. I know how to do this, right? And that's, again, it's just the way technology is going. We're getting to a point where maybe you don't need to manually fly the airplane anymore. Now you just got to be there in case something goes wrong. And that's, again, perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. When it comes to the actual MCP and using the actual MCP, let's go through and talk about some of the switches, the switchology, and we'll kind of go from there. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the flight director system. Flight director system, it's all going to depend on what airplane you are on or what the airplane is established with. So for the most part, when I go from off to on my flight directors, I get my flight director will come on in this particular time, right? So this is the captain's side. We're not doing this for any type of checklist or anything like that, because remember, this is not a part of any training program. This is just some guy in his basement who likes to talk about airplanes. Okay. So when I go from flight director off to on, I'm going to start with the captains, and then I'm going to go to the FOs. Part of that is the system logic behind it on which one is in command. Technically, it's whatever, neither here nor there in this particular case. Just do whatever your checklist says or whatever your flow says. All right, so in this case, flight directors are on. I go into takeoff mode, which is the TOTO, and the little green box will end up going away eventually, but I don't have the animation for that, so just ignore that portion. What I will say about the flight directors is, again, it's going to depend on how your airplane was made. Your airplane could have been made with dual Q or the crossbars, which was what we have here. Dual Q just means that you have a vertical and you have a lateral that you basically have to cross the X or cross the T to be in the center, right? And that, some people will argue it's more accurate. Some people will argue that it's harder to use. It all, to me, really seems like whatever the pilots grew up using, that's what they like using. So and by growing up, I mean going through training. So if you go through training and you're used to dual Q, dual Q, dual Q, and then you get an airplane that's a V-bar, where you take the little airplane, put it in the V-bar, and you're good, they're going to hate the V-bar. And vice versa. If you grow up V-bar, 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 and then you get an airplane that's a dual Q, you're like, what the hell am I looking at? But in actuality, it does seem like the dual Q is more accurate as far as keeping you on track and keeping you on altitude and on heading. It's just what it seems like to me, observing some sims and stuff like that. You can make your own determination, but honestly, it's up to the company depending on how they're going to set up their aircraft. Some may have a mixed fleet. Some may have, they have one standard that they use. Ironically, I've worked for, 3 different companies, and the only thing that was standard between any of the aircraft was the fact that they changed it to a dual Q. So I take that for what it's worth, But all the flight director switches do is they give you your flight director, as long as they're working correctly, right? So if your flight directors are working correctly, you'll get your flight directors. Now notice down here on the bottom of the screen, on the bottom of the ADI, you have the little green letters that come on. In the autopilot video I did before, we talked about those are called FMAs, or flight mode annunciators. Okay, so flight mode annunciators tell us that whatever switch we just did on the MCP either armed or engaged a particular mode. Turning on our flight directors put the aircraft into a flight director mode, meaning that, okay, our flight directors are what we're basing our navigation on, or our direction on in this case. And then whenever we go to autopilot, when we turn the autopilot on and we go to center command, and that's what the letters here on the button actually mean, CMD, that means command. Whenever we turn it to command, this flight director down here will actually change to CMD, letting you know that when you push the button to engage the autopilot actually did engage. Okay, so that's how we're going to use the FMAs. I'm going to explain that a little bit later in the presentation, but for right now, that's a pretty quick overview. Now, for autopilot operation, so when you hit the switch, when you go up and you push the switch, and you put the center to command, which is what this is going to do, right? Dink, I hit the button, center to command, little light comes on the bottom. That little light, what I want people to really understand, that light means nothing. Fight me. No. So what I mean is, just because I push the button does not mean that the autopilot is on. It means I've requested it to be on. It means I've pushed the button, requested the autopilot to be on. How do I know the autopilot engaged? the flight mode annunciator, the FMA, on the screen. It'll say CMD. It'll tell me that it is in command. So, again, it's one of those things where just because the light's on doesn't mean that's what's going on. The light comes on because it's requesting, it's arming, it's, whatever you want to call it. But you can only know that it happened by looking at your FMAs. Okay, and we'll talk about that more as we go. Now, single pilot operation, you're only going to have one light on. Right? So single autopilot operation, you're only going to have the one light on whichever one you have in command. And again, center command is the normal for autopilot operations on a 7.6 or 7.5. Now, we're about 16 minutes into the video. I want somebody to comment why we use center command as the standard. Why is the center autopilot the most used autopilot, the normal autopilot that's used? And I'm curious to see your answers, if any. We'll see. But I'm not going to answer that for you yet. When we go into approach mode, so meaning that we're coming in on an approach and we get to the point where we hit the approach switch, which is going to be located right here, and we'll talk about that here in just a bit. I push the approach switch, the little light comes on telling me that I've requested the approach mode. Then I get two other lights. I get all three lights on my autopilot because I'm requesting all three autopilots to engage at that particular time. And there's an altitude associated with when the autopilots actually will engage if all three are going to engage. Do you know what altitude that is? I think I gave you enough time. It's 1,500 feet AGL. So 1,500 feet on the radio altimeter, somewhere thereabout. Now, granted, it varies. It's like a plus or minus 20 feet or whatever. And there's nowhere written that says it's plus or minus 20 feet. I'm just saying that when you see it happen, it may not happen right at 1,500 feet. It may happen at 1,490, or it may happen at 1,510, or it may happen at 1,505. At 1,500 feet AGL on the radio altimeter, all three autopilots should engage at that particular time. Now, how do I know that the three autopilots have engaged? What do I see in the flight deck that tells me that? Well, I don't have an example of it right here, but I do have another video that I'm going to post up here in the corner. It's talking about the auto land status annunciators, or the ASAs. The ASAs determine whether or not all three autopilots turned on or engaged or didn't. And if you want more of that in detail, let me know, and I'll make another video about the ASAs in a little bit more detail. Okay, so the other part to engaging stuff is disengaging stuff, right? So for the autopilot, we have this cool little bar located directly below the buttons that you can disengage. You hit it, you disengage it, all three will disengage. There's some other ways we can disengage. We can disengage with our little switch, our little autopilot disconnect switch that's on our yoke. So you click, right? Because if I click it once, what happens? I get a warning horn that goes off. And I get a warning light. And then if I hit it again, it clears it. So that's why in the video, he says click. And then the other click is for the auto throttles. So click for the autopilot, it'll disconnect. The other way I can disconnect the autopilot may or may not be an approved way to do it, but it will kick it off, is if I have single autopilot operation, and I hit my electric trim switches. If I hit the electric trim with one autopilot engaged, it kicks off. If I have multiple autopilots engaged, the system does not care about you putting in any kind of electric trim input. It ignores it. It inhibits those switches. Okay. Questions on autopilot operation? If there is, leave them down in the comments. Next thing we're going to talk about is the auto throttle system. So the auto throttle system has mainly 3 different switches that engage your auto throttles. So in this particular case, you can see the auto throttle arm switch is off. With it being off, that means I cannot engage my auto throttles. Because to engage my auto throttles, they have to be armed. So auto throttle arm. Okay. And then what will end up happening is the lights will come on and then they'll go out, letting you know that, okay, it's running basically like a check in the background. Okay. Now, these are what are called speed modes. So I've got my EPR or N1, which when that button is pressed, it will move the throttles to a specific EPR or N1 setting, depending on what type of engine you have. If you have Rolls or Pratt, it's going to be an EPR. If you have a GE, it's going to be an N1. And the switch might just say thrust or THR. So there's many different ways that thing could be labeled, but all it is it's a setting that it's going to move your thrust levers up to, and generally that's used for departure. So you pull up, for GEs anyway, you put the thrust levers up approximately 70% in one, and then when the engines are stable, all right, press the button to get takeoff thrust. So boom, takeoff thrust set. It moves up to whatever you've put it in there, whether it's 99, 95, whatever it is. And then that is what the airplane will sustain until it takes off, and then it goes into climb mode at a certain point. Or you could put it in the climb mode by hitting the climb button, but that's another thing. So speed mode, basically what that's going to do is that's going to pitch and power to maintain the speed. Whatever speed you have dialed in, or if the FMC is running it, whatever speed is in the FMC. And then flight level change. So when we hit flight level change, you change your altitude, you hit flight level change. It's going to basically fly, again, a pitch and power setting to get whatever it needs to get to that altitude with whatever power or whatever speed you have in the window. The little select button there, changes it back and forth between Mach and indicated. And then this, see this little that is actually a push button. So that's an actual push button. It's also a dial. So if I need to slow down, I will turn the little dial down to, in this case, 200 knots. And then the aircraft will start to slow. My auto throttles will move back, and I'll start to slow to that 200 knots. Now, yeah, so I just went from 200 down to 146, and the aircraft will continue to slow. And then I can go back up to 215 or whatever, right? Like, it doesn't really matter what speed I'm putting in here. For the presentation portion, because you don't know unless you're out in the system, right? And you're actually on the approach, or you're actually, maybe you got to reduce speed because of traffic, or maybe you got to speed up because of traffic, or maybe whatever your clearance is. Yeah. Now we just sped back up to 310, and now it'll go back up. There's that little select button. So the little SEL right here, that is what causes that to change in between Mach and indicated airspeed for knots. So, depending on what you're looking for, you can change it between the two. Let's see. So, let's talk just real quick about speed intervention when it comes to this. And this is only going to be if we're in LNAV VNAV. And if I'm in LNAV VNAV, whatever is set in the FMC is what the aircraft is going to fly as far as speed is concerned. That's your speed limits are all inside your FMC. So this indicated airspeed is going to be blank. There's not going to be anything there because you're not in control of it whatsoever. So in this particular case, you can see that the little orange bug on our airspeed indicator is set just over 300 knots. And that's what the aircraft is going to be trying to go to if we don't do anything. Now, let's say, as ATC usually does, they call up and they screw up your plans and they say, okay, we need you to slow to 275. And that's essentially what I'm set at right now is 270. But they say, okay, you need to slow to 275. Okay, so what can I do to kind of stay in VNAV, but also set my speed without having to change anything in the FMC? Well, that's easy. I go to speed intervention. How do I go to speed intervention? It's going to be this little button right there. Now, remember I said that's a rotary switch, but it's also a push button. Wherever I push that button, it's going to open that speed window at whatever my current speed is. And then I can dial it from there and the aircraft will adjust, keeping me in vertical navigation. Okay, now why do I want to stay in vertical navigation? Why is that important? Vertical navigation, or VNAV, and if I'm in a climb or descent and I'm using VNAV, it will keep my altitude restrictions inside the FMC. So if I have an altitude restriction where I got to level off at 10,000 feet for whatever reason because the approach says so, as long as I stay in VNAV, it will come down, it'll capture that 10,000, and it'll, off it goes, right? It keeps me safe in that regard. Now, granted, just like everything else, it's garbage in, garbage out. So if I have the wrong number in my FMC, then it's going to do the wrong thing. But if we assume that all of our information is correct because we've done our job and we've checked it and double checked it, and we've had the other pilot check it and double check it, then I'm covered as far as my altitude restrictions are concerned. Right? So it'll keep me safe in that regard, keep me from being violated. Now, if I want to leave speed intervention, so in this case, all right, so I hit it, it opens at 275. ATC says I need you to stay at 280 for spacing. All right, I dial it up to 280. The aircraft will adjust to 280 knots and remain in vertical navigation, or VNAV. Once I'm done with the restriction and ATC says resume normal speed or resume, whatever, all I have to do is push that button again. I push that button again, screen goes blank, and my aircraft goes back to whatever is located in the FMC. But again, the FMC is garbage in, garbage out, so please make sure you're double checking that, right? Make sure that information is correct. Okay, so it was at this point in the editing process that I decided to split this video into two. Rather than torture you guys with an hour-long video, I decided to split it up into 26-ish and 24-ish minute videos. So this is the end of part 1. And then I'll put part 2 right here. All right, thanks, guys.